They're going to Central Europe. They're going to Western Europe.
You said built.
Yes.
Who built the railroads in America and allowed for us to have expansion out west? Who built that?
Yes, a lot of Chinese people.
No, you said the operative word there was built. Built. Who built? Okay.
Who designed them? Who had the genius to imagine railroads? Europeans.
The genius to imagine railroads. Okay.
Yeah.
But you said
are there railroads in Africa?
You said yes. You said built.
Why?
You said. Hold on. You said. Okay. First of all,
that is absolutely true.
First of all, the greatest genius when it came to the building of the pyramids. Do you know what
those are? White people, by the way.
Who are white people?
The Egyptians are not African. I'm sorry.
Do you know where Egypt is?
Yes, it's in North Africa.
Okay, stop. You stop right there. You just said that you said the Egyptians are not African.
Are white South Africans African?
Wait. Yes, they are African. See, okay, to be African means you come from the continent of Africa. So if you come from the continent of Africa, that's who you are. So that means you're an African. So and you do know. Do you also deny science that man originated from Africa, or do you say that's false science?
What are you talking about? I mean, what are you referring to?
I'm talking
science.
Archaeology. I'm talking biology. I'm talking science in terms of the where did man originate? White scientists.
Egypt was an amazing civilization. It was not created by black Africans. I'm sorry.
It wasn't. Who created it?
People who are white.
How are people?
You can look actually look at art, and they differentiate between races.
I got to ask you a question. How do you
from ancient Egyptian art?
You do know those were black people. You do know. You do know from science you can't get black from white. You can get white from black. You do know when it comes to evolution.
What?
When it comes.
I see what you're saying.
Do you never studied science?
I see what you're. Yes, I have.
No, so but
I'm not a scientist.
But man originated in Africa. Yes or no?
That is a consensus. Yes.
Okay. So if man originated in Africa, which means that they were Africans, then all of a sudden, when you talk about the amazing works of the Egyptians, they were people of color. I know that's a little rough for you to handle, but I know you want to hold on to that somehow thinking whites built the pyramids. But I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, we did.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Because first of all, they were building things in Egypt while white Europeans were still in caves. That's a fact.
That's
a fact. Okay,
sure.
I'm still.
Egypt, as pointed out before, was the northeastern region of ancient Ethiopia. The 6 cataracts of the Nile were the great watermarks of the heartland of the blacks from whence African culture spread over the continent. But nowhere was it as pronounced as in Egypt. This northern sector of the Ethiopian Empire had been the object of world attention from the earliest times. The fact was that it was the center of the crossroads from all directions leading into Africa from Asia and Europe. This also explains how the Asians came to occupy and control a fourth of Egypt, Lower Egypt, before the unification of the two lands in the 3rd millennium BC. With the relentless spread of the desert and the attending scarcity of arable land, there was a heavier concentration of Africans in the Nile Delta and Valley, the areas with the richest soil in the empire. The great agricultural system that was developed along the overflowing Nile was one of the sources of the wealth to support the great cultural advances. The other was the gold mines below the first cataract. This was also the magnet that drew Caucasian peoples from many lands. As these increased in number and variety, the undermining of black power was accelerated. The melting pot of the races began around the northern perimeter. The end result was always the same. The blacks were pushed to the bottom of the social, economical, and political ladder whenever and wherever the Asians and their mulatto offsprings gained control. This scheme weakened the blacks by turning their half-white brothers against them cannot be overemphasized because it began in early times, became the universal practice of whites, and is still one of the cornerstones of the edifice of white power. The white Asians were generally very proud of their sons by black women, but these black mothers remained slaves, while their mulatto sons and daughters were born free and moreover classified as white. As such, they formed a social class that, while never recognized as equal with the real whites, had just about all other privileges of free men. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. Happy Monday. I am Joseph Ward, and I am continuing my reading of Chancellor Williams' The Destruction of Black Civilization. And I'm starting on chapter 2. Chapter 2 is page, what page is that? Page 62. So I actually read from pages 62 to page 80. So that's what I read for this video. So make sure you have your copy of the book and you're reading chapter 2, Ethiopia's oldest daughter, Egypt, The Great Deception. I started from pages 62 and I ended on 80, right? And so also make sure you like this video, comment, subscribe, share, all of that. You know, that helps the algorithm, help more people see these videos, help, you know, me be able to grow this channel and get this information out further to our people. So one of the greatest things about this video today and what we're reading in chapter 2 so far is Chancellor Williams is giving a historical context to the concept of race and of people being subjugated because of how they look and how people are turned against each other, right? So he starts out talking about, well, we're going to get into, but he starts out talking about the location of the Nile and, you know, Black power being undermined by the Caucasians or the Asians that came in. Because remember, last video we talked about Africa being invaded by the Asians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Europeans. Now the Chinese are back in. You know, other groups came in and invaded Africa. Africa has been the jewel of the world, especially Egypt, been the jewel of the world since forever. Even for different groups of people within Africa, and that's what we're going to get into. So he's talking about how the Asians came in, and one of the tactics that the Asians used was to make sons with the African women. And when they make, well, not just make sons, make children with the African women. When they make children with the African women, the children more so identify with the white or the Asian parents. So they're denying their Africanness. So they're basically mentally and physically whitening the race. You can conquer a people better when you whiten the race, when you get the people to assimilate fully. When the people assimilate fully into the culture of the oppressors. And a part of that assimilation is having babies with the oppressor and mating with the oppressor, marrying the oppressor, having relations with the oppressor, helping to whiten the race. That's a tactic that was used, and you're going to see as we read more, as we get into it. The African women who mated with the Asians and even the Europeans who came in did not, well, the bulk of them, their status was not raised. Their children's status was raised for the most part, especially if the child came out looking right. But the child didn't come out looking right, which is white, then that child was relegated to the bottom rungs of society. So the colorism, the racism, and a lot of the psychological effects that we have today and a lot of the tactics that were employed on us by Europeans are not new tactics. They're old tactics that have been employed on Black people since the Asians started coming in, invading Africa in the early, around 3000 BC, right? And so we're getting into the idea of Africa or Egypt itself. We're also getting into the idea of Egypt not being built by Black people. Chancellor Williams is debunking that. Egypt was built by Black people. Egypt was inspired by Black people. Egypt is Ethiopia's eldest daughter. It came from the bottom of the Nile, from the start of the Nile, came up the Nile. This culture, these people, these African people, and over time, because of the intermingling with the Asians and the Europeans and the Arabs, Egypt was whitened over time. It started Black, but it ended white. But by the time the whites came in, at least 3,000 years had been passed. So we're gonna get deep into this. You see the video at the beginning, the white man going back and forth with Roland Martin about Egypt being built by white people, but he have no real proof. So we're going to further debunk that Egypt was built by white people. So let's get back into it. This is page 64, first paragraph. The picture was generally the same from about 4000 BC. In the Asian-held areas in the north, the blacks had hard choices to make. As elsewhere on the continent, they had the choice of remaining in their homeland and being reduced to the status of servants and slaves, or if they were well-to-do members of the professional classes, architects, engineers, or skilled craftsmen, they could remain, become integrated into Asian society, be classified as white, and even hold high positions, or finally, they could reject integration into Asian culture and migrate southwards. This, the great majority did. It is therefore not without significance that even today, a member of African tribes 4,000 miles south from Egypt still claim that as their ancestral homeland. And I forgot to mention that, right? While the assimilation is being forced upon the African people, they did have a choice. They had the choice to fight back, they had the choice to leave, or they had a choice to stay and assimilate. A number of them chose to fight back, and a number of them chose to leave. And they left because they didn't want to assimilate into the white culture. Because remember, it started black and ended white, but they had to whiten the people's minds as well. It wasn't just arms and coming in and taking over like that. They had to whiten their minds, and they whitened the population through mating. There were blacks who neither fled nor the Asian. There were blacks who neither fled before the Asian advance nor submitted to enslavement. These also rejecting amalgamation as the process of transforming the race stood their ground fighting back and were generally wiped out. In short, the Africans held Upper Egypt south, which is the south, while the Asiatics held Lower Egypt in the north. Kurt Seith, in attempting to reconstruct the prehistory of Egypt, concluded that the division of the country between Africans in the south and the Asiatics in the north was due mostly to a split over religion. According to his view, the Africans refused to accept the cult of Horus that dominated the Nile Delta. They therefore formed a second nation in Upper Egypt and established their national religious shrines at Omnos, Thebes, Thines, and Napata. Other scholars insist that the two lands meant that the Africans had simply separated themselves from the Asians. These, unlike Seith, do not inquire about the reasons. What actually happened in prehistoric times, however, was on such a grand scale over long periods of time that patterns even of unwritten history became clear and understandable. The Asians and Europeans were entering in increasing numbers and pushing the Africans farther and farther away from the Mediterranean, pushing them farther and farther towards what became Africa south of the Sahara. But the Africans had taken their first firm stand within their Egypt, making it two lands, exactly as the Sudan is two lands today, with the Arabs and colored Arabs in the north and the Africans in the south. And also for exactly the same reason, to escape white oppression, and the Sudanese blacks concentrated in the south for the same reason, to escape white and colored oppression. So the things that we experienced here in America was nothing new. African people had been experiencing things like that since the Asians first invaded, since the Europeans came in, since the Arabs came in. All these different groups of people who came into Egypt not only forced assimilation, they wiped people out, but they pushed them out of their lands. They pushed them off the lands that they've been there for millennia. They've been there for centuries, thousands of years, long time, basically what I'm saying. Been there a long time, and were pushed out by the invaders. The black Africans along the Nile Valley were invaded by the Asians, by the Europeans, by the Arabs. These groups have been coming in forever. Well, not forever, but they've been coming in for a long time. So listen to this. It was the science of archaeology along with ancient historical records that support my viewpoint that the Africans, while being either subjugated or pushed southward, fought back in a long series of wars to regain their ancient homeland along the Mediterranean. As early as the end of the 4th millennium BC, and even before the first dynasty in Egypt, there are records of a great African victory over the Asians in the north. The blacks had established their Egyptian capital at Nekab. The royal palace was just across the river at Nekab. Thebes and Napata continued to be the cultural centers of the black world. So, you know, information is there according to Chancellor Williams. So the blacks, if that's not their original lands, first of all, where did the blacks come from? And as we're going to further read, these groups who came in were nomadic groups. So where did all this high culture and high civilization come in with nomadic groups? Now, the Africans had high culture. The Africans had high civilization. The Africans had all of this knowledge of the splendor that was around them in the lands that they built. But the nomadic groups didn't have that. They didn't have that when they got there. So that's a point that had to be taken. As the historic period opened in Egypt, it appeared that the Africans were retaking the whole of their country. The Palmero Stone records, the Palmero Stone records victory after victory over the Asians. Finally, the great triumph came when the African king Menes defeated the Asians decisively, united all Egypt under African rule again, and thus began the historic First Dynasty. Historians of ancient Egypt would do well to pause and ponder longer over the question of the two lands. Those who are interested in the truth about the black man's history will be compelled to do so. For the most significant part of the black Africans' history developed in Egypt, and the division of the country into two lands, one predominantly Asian and the other African, marked the first great stage of the unending pressures that steadily forced the blacks from the northern areas. But for countless centuries, the greater region was held by the blacks. This was the southern region called Upper Egypt. It seems quite clear that this seesaw conflict between Africans and Asians covered centuries back into prehistory, just as it was to continue intermittently for nearly 5,000 years after Menes. Indeed, the Zanzibar Revolution and the purely racial conflict in the Sudan are simply a present-day continuity of the ancient struggle between the invaders and the invaded. After the Asian North was subdued, the African capital city was moved from the Keb to the south, from the Keb in the south to the north, where the two lands meet. Here, astride what had been the boundary, the eternal city of Memphis was built, named for the king, and like the Thebes, became the focal point of black power and one of the chief centers of African civilization. In completing the building of Memphis, Menes' nephew apparently believed that he was making a final settlement of the Asian problem, and that this capital city would stand forever. The massive fortification system built to control the Asians stood for centuries. The Africans' literal belief in immortality was reflected in their building and burial arrangements. The early three-chambered brick mastabas foreshadowed the later pyramids that were to surround the city like watchmen and form a line of march from there to the Giza Desert. During one of the longer reigns in history, Menes brought about the kind of stability and innovations in administration that not only provided a solid foundation for a first dynasty, but also the economic and social conditions necessary for the more uniform expansion of religion, the arts, crafts, and mathematical sciences. Here too is where Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Greece, although not as advanced, may have made cultural contributions to the Africans and received much from them in return. So what we're about to get into and what we're leading up to is the invasions and the effects of the invasions, right? The Africans were there first. There's plenty of archaeological evidence, of physical evidence, of written evidence, of evidence that was left. Chancellor Williams even goes on to say that I think either Khufu, I might be mistaken the names, but now we'll read it, but either Khufu or Khafre, those pharaohs are the face of the Sphinx. And, you know, the Sphinx is said to be old, but he says he's going to tell you, we're going to read, I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're going to read the dynasty that Chancellor Williams says that the Sphinx was built. But basically, all the information that he's espousing and all the information that we can find, especially more and more information is coming out now, especially when I was doing my research for this video, just coming up with information after information, or article after article, or video after video, talking about the debunking of the Egyptians being white, or Egypt being built by invaders, or the Asians, or whites, or even Arabs. So there's like mountains and mountains of evidence to debunk that anybody else built Egypt except the Black Africans. And remember, we said Black Africans, the Black Africans, because we're also talking about a mulatto class. There was a mulatto class of Africans that I spoke about earlier that came about from the concubinage of black African women becoming concubines, either becoming concubines by being given to the invaders as gifts, or being taken. But that was also a plan in the process to whiten the nation physically. So there's all these different tactics that were being used and that are still being used now to undermine and oppress and keep Black people at a subservient level. It's not new. What we're learning now from destruction of a Black civilization is what is happening to Black people now, and what has happened to Black people in America also happened to Black people in Africa. But the problem is, because we didn't know the history, we didn't learn from it. Now, the problem is still we don't know the history, so we don't learn from it. We may come across it, we may read it, but we don't know it. That's why we're not learning from it. So he goes on to talk about the external influence myth. The Greek contribution was the greatest. It was accidental, one of those accidents of history that turns out to be highly important. In this case, the Greeks unwittingly applied the second name to the city of Menes, or Memphis. The original name of Memphis was Menes, and the Greeks called it Memphis and Aegyptos, to the whole of the country. For Memphis was also called, he said, Haiku Ptah, or the mansion of the south of Ptah, the god protector of the city. From the Greek Aegyptos, Memphis became Egypt, and Egypt became the name of the two lands extending from the Mediterranean to the first cataract. There was no Egypt before the Black king from whose name it was directly derived. Before that country was called Kim or Kimi, another name indicating its Black inhabitants, and not the color of the soil, as some writers have needlessly strained themselves in asserting. Indeed, the strong predilection of both Europeans and the white Asians to replace the names of other peoples and places with their own terminologies was at once a blessing and a curse in the history of the Blacks. Not knowing the racist twist that modern history was to take, the early historian, geographers, and travelers reported what they found and described peoples in their own terms of speech. In doing so, they established beyond question that the Blacks were the first Egyptians and the builders of the ancient civilizations. For it was these early writers and not the Blacks who made it clear that although the invading Euro-Asians had finally established themselves in about 1/4 of northern Ethiopia, or Lower Egypt, as early as the 4th millennium BC, the Blacks, with equal firmness, held all the rest from the 29th north parallel to the 10th south. It was the whites, not the Blacks, who called Africa the land of the Blacks until Asian and European invasions made it expedient to change this to mean African countries not yet taken over by Caucasians, and later to Africa south of the Sahara. Even this has to be qualified now, as the whites dominate Southern Africa and Portuguese held areas. The early whites, again, not the Blacks, not only defined Upper Egypt, all Upper Egypt, as Black to distinguish it from predominantly white Lower Egypt, but they settled the matter for posterity by calling Upper Egypt the bald and the Black Thebans, because Thebes, or no way, was the oldest and greatest center of Black civilization. So changing, like I said last time, the changing of the names is also another tactic that they use to whiten the areas up. They go in, they fight for the area, and if they can conquer and win the area, they change the name. Or even before they come back and conquer the area, they change the name. It's about whitening the area. It's about erasing everything about the original inhabitants, the Black people, erasing everything everything. So they won't exist, and we can give them a history. We can give them a culture. We can give them names. We can give them a mindset that will always be subservient to their oppressors. Think about it. That's what white supremacy is about, but that's what domination is about, to go in and rearrange everything. Everything has to become white. Everything has to become Arabic. Everything has to become the Asian, what the Asians are. Those that invaded Africa in the early days, that invaded Egypt, that invaded the Nile Valley. There was also the external influence on early African speech and writing in Egypt. As more and more Asians moved into Upper Egypt after the unification of the two lands, the mingling of the two peoples not only produced a new breed of Egyptians, but also an increasingly Afro-Asian language and writing system that differed markedly from the original African writing as it was developed below the First Cataract. Developments in Asia and Europe 1,000 and 2,000 years after the golden age of Black civilization helped to obscure that civilization or paint it over as an entirely Eurasian achievement. Our task is to begin the removal of this false inclusion, of this false incrustation, hardened as it is by 2,000 years of unchallenged growth. The time continuum in the history of the Blacks is highly important in reference to the state of civilization in the lands from which the invading groups came during the first 1,000 years of Black ascendancy in Egypt and southern Ethiopia or the Sudan. The record is quite clear that the incursive groups were largely tent-dwelling nomads, as I stated earlier. They had no tradition of great cities with imposing temples, obelisks, pyramids, or indeed stone masonry at all. In particular, one should note that the number of centuries after Thebes and Memphis before the ancient cities were found. And he has a timeline. So it goes to Noe or Thebes in prehistory, Memphis at 3100 BC, Rome as a village at 1000 BC, Rome as a town at 250 BC, Athens as a village in 1200 BC, Athens as a city in 360 BC, Antioch in 400 BC, Jerusalem in 1400 BC, and Babylon in 2100 BC, right? In short, what great contributions did those roaming nomads have to make to an already highly developed Black civilization? Since even Jerusalem was not in existence, what people in Lower Egypt came from a country within a city as great as Thebes or Memphis? So once again, going in, using another tactic and influencing the writing, influencing the culture. Now we're talking about cultural influences, a total whitening of the Black people, a total whitening. So now we're even going after the writing systems. The writing will be influenced by us. So when you look back at it, people were asking, wonder, did Black people really do this? And they would try to have overwhelming evidence to prove that Black people did not have anything to do with this, which we all know is a lie. It was the beginning of a new era in the history of the Blacks when the Ethiopian king turned the course of the Nile River by building a great dam at the border between Upper and Lower Egypt for the site of the new capital that was to bear his name. For generations, Memphis was already entirely an all-African city with white Asian villages slowly growing up around the outer skirts. For the Asians were a very smart and very cunning people. Listen to this. Once conquered, they feigned complete and humble acceptance of African rule. Far from showing the slightest signs of any feeling of racial superiority, they were such masters of the art of disassembling that they could hoodwink the Africans, often under the guise of brotherhood, by capitalizing on their often dark complexions, similar institutions, intermarriages, and mixing with the Black population generally as far as possible. All this was the direct route to repeating Asian ascendancy on the continent few Africans seem to see. For they are, as a race, too ready to forgive and forget past evils committed by foreigners. Whereas, on the other hand, the fellow Asian tribe can easily become a traditional enemy and continue as such for many generations that no one remembers what the original quarrel was about. So the blacks were apparently unconcerned about the Asian villages springing up just outside of Memphis, nor about the largest one that was, nor about the largest one that was more rapidly developing just across the river on the right bank. This community was to become the Asian city of Fostat that challenged the supremacy of the capital city and eventually helped to change its African character and cause its final destruction. Yet, what I have just stated so briefly occurred only after nearly 3,000 years of glorious history. 3,000 years had passed before this happened, right? It remained the capital and one of the greatest cities of Egypt and the world from the 1st to the 12th dynasty when it yielded to Thebes again. But it was still a great city when Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BC. Its death knell was sounded only when Arab tribes overran the land of Cairo and rose to overshadow it. The 2nd and 3rd dynasties were also African. Most writers will not flatly state this. They generally designate these dynasties as Thinite, Memphite, or followers of Seth. One has to know that the first dynasty was African and Memphite or Thinite, so called after the name of the sacred city, Thinis, and the coats of Seth and Amun were African, and Seth and Amun, they were African. That the 4th dynasty was indigenous is equally clear. These were the chief pyramid builders, the Great Pyramid being the largest and highest building on earth until modern times. It was built during the reign of Khufu in 2590, and Khufu reigned from 2590 BC to 2567 BC. His nephew Khafre carried on and built the 2nd Great Pyramid. Now, this is what I was trying to make sure I made clear. So Khufu built the Great Pyramid, but Khafre built the 2nd Great Pyramid, and Chancellor Williams is giving Khafre credit for building the Sphinx. But he went further to build the Great Sphinx, and as though he was intended to settle the question of his racial identity for all ages to come. He and his African features so boldly and clearly carved into the portrait statue that not even a fool could seriously doubt that this mighty monarch was a Negro. He was therefore among the first to break with the classical Caucasoid stereotypes in Egyptian portraits. Having determined what periods Africans were referred to as Thinites, Memphites, Thebans, Cushites, Libyans, Ethiopians, Nubians, etc., a major problem in African history was near solution. Some of the disguising masks were thus removed, but much still remained to be done in developing guidelines to identification, because the work of effacing the black man's role in world history was so thoroughly done over many centuries that it is amazing how universal a consensus was reached by Caucasian writers in almost every age. Yet it should have occurred to some that, since they themselves knew very well who the black civilization builders were, painstaking research will later reveal they all tried to conceal. And that's what I stated earlier. If you go look now, you'll find a lot of information debunking that white people were the original settlers, the original builders of Egypt, the original anything in Egypt. They're going to point back to black. The deeper you go, the deeper back you go, the blacker it is. But the lies were created to keep us oppressed. And lies, because if we learned the history, we would have better understood what was happening to us and what can happen to us. And going back to what Dr. John Henry Clark says, we have no friends. All other groups of people who had a chance to rule us, they did. I point out repeatedly also that some of the bias is not deliberate, but often so deeply rooted in the white scholar is totally unaware of it. One of these, for example, is Sir Flinders W.M. Petrie, one of the greatest archaeologists and historians of Egypt. He tried so hard to be scientifically objective. Yet, when he unearthed a famous king or queen who was unmistakably Negro, he seemed to be quite puzzled. But like most of his fellow investigations, Some of his best thinking was set in motion from a rational explanation. Thus, the find of Sneferu's Black Queen, Mertifris, I'm saying the name wrong, Mertifris, indicated that the royal wife might be of an inferior race and not of a high type. Yeah, all right. But the guidelines I found useful in identifying who are. Number one is knowing the terms used when referring to early Africans. 2, noting rulers whom the writers concede to be Africans or persons with marked Negroid features, and tracing his line to succeeding dynasties, i.e. the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th dynasties. 3, noting what kings or queens in their dynasty in later dynasties claimed an African ruler of an earlier period as their ancestor and accordingly venerated and worshipped. Number 4, similarly, what kings and queens take the name of ancient Black rulers and build temples and monuments to perpetuate their memory. 5, the evidence in stone inscriptions on monuments and stelae of various kinds. 6, to what race did the invading rulers from the South belong, and over what kind of people did they rule below the First Cataract? Number 7, and finally, the unearthed statues and portraits of kings and queens of Egypt who were pure Africans, unless physical anthropologists now wish to change their criteria for determining race. There are a few guidelines to early Egyptians as early Black Africans. The fact of Black rulers, however, is not as important as the fact of an indigenous Black population from which they sprang. For these early Blacks were themselves a great people, expelling on many fronts from a line of builders to distant in the past that it seems to have extended into the Stone Ages. It was a society of scientists, scholars, originated religions, which organized priesthoods, mathematicians, scribes, architects, engineers, standing armies, and generals, some stone and brick masons, carpenters, artists, sculptors, cloth makers, slaves, farmers, teachers, gold and silversmiths, blacksmiths, and so on and on, the widest spectrum of an advanced society. Africa, as the cradle of civilization, meant exactly that. These Blacks developed one of the oldest writing languages. The Egyptian language was an African language, with later Asiatic influence similar to that of Arabic and the African language known as Swahili. And it was totally destroyed and replaced by a non-indigenous tongue, as were other African creations. Nothing better marked the increasing cleavage between Blacks and their half-brothers beyond the cataracts than this linguistic nationalism, the refusal of the retreating Blacks to use the Asianized Egyptian tongue. So, I mean, just Chancellor Williams giving more and more proof on his end from his account of the Egyptians being Black, the Africans being Black. Like you said, not necessarily focusing on all of the outcomes of the civilization, but the civilization itself, the root of it. Who were the people who all of this culture came from? Because we know it came from the beginning of the Nile and flowed into the Mediterranean, flowed up, it flowed north or flowed south, right? Egypt, if Egypt is Ethiopia's oldest daughter, then we need to study Ethiopia. But we even got to go back and study Taseti. You have to study who were the people there in the beginning, because we know Africans predated Europeans. We know Africans predated these Asians. We have the archaeological proof. We have the bones and the grounds to prove that. So since we know the African people go back further than all these other people, and we know this high culture existed before these people had any type of culture, when they were just nomads, then what we talking about? Now let's get into this mulatto problem. The recent revival of Black is Beautiful is no more than just that, a revival. The great majority of ancient Blacks took great pride in their color, and their resistance to amalgamation may be so interpreted. For one thing they had observed in Egypt was that a dynasty beginning as all Black could remain unbroken over generations and still in the end become near white in color, not with a Black face in the royal lineage. Like I said earlier, Egypt began white. Egypt began Black. Egypt began as an African culture, as an African civilization. The Nile Valley itself began from the blacks. But over time, through invasions, after invasions, it became white. This two-way process of intermingling and direct aggression meant victory for the white Asians in the end. They were already within the country as Egyptians when the conquering hordes from their various homelands swept in. Many were nationalistic Egyptians and as such fought the invaders along with the Africans. Others, though born in Egypt, also were loyal to their fathers' native countries and sided with their armies. Since the first to be called Egyptians exclusively were half African and half Asian, their general hostility to their mother's race was a social phenomenon that should not be passed over lightly, even though that development followed a universal pattern and therefore was not unpopular to the Egyptians. Its nature is essentially opportunistic, a quest for security, recognition, and advancement by identifying with and becoming a part of the new power elite of the conquerors. Does that sound familiar? The invading conquerors not only capture and control all political and economic power by military might, but even though they might be nomadic barbarians, they generally claim to be from a higher civilization and therefore reinforce the myth of being superior. In fact, not just because of military conquest. So once again, I'm not going to keep repeating myself. I'm going reading, but the stuff is not new. It's not new. Reference was made to the Egyptians' race of their mothers. For in Egypt, as elsewhere, it was a one-way sexual process. The mother race always kept its own women sacred and secluded behind the walls of their homes. They were not allowed to go outside except under guard. Now, African women had no such restrictions or protections. Sound familiar? Does it sound familiar? They were fair game to men of all races, and for them, it was always open season. Many Black women preferred death by suicide. One of these two, history does not sing. The master race then, while loudly proclaiming a strange doctrine of racial purity, for itself has been the world's leader in bastardizing other people. So it's been on the grand scale in the United States and South America and East and South Africa, and so it was in Egypt. Hey, the white man was the original deadbeat baby daddy. Get that through your head. The bastardization of African children, of half African children, had been going on since the first invasions into Africa from the Asians. It didn't start with the Europeans, it started with the Asians. The Asians did it, the Arabs did it, the Europeans did it, and every group that came into Africa did it. The bastardization of half African children. And the Europeanization, or the Asian, or the Asiatic, or turning their mind European or Asian, right? Making them turn on their mothers, turn on that side of them, the Africanness, reject their Africanness, so they can assimilate and be loved by their father's race or the master race. The evolution of the Egyptians as a nationality group is as interesting as the anti-African attitude, although the latter differs not at all from that of many mixed breeds with African blood is elsewhere. It has been stated that the original Egyptians were Black, half African, and half Asian. The general racial pattern changed, however, as the centuries passed along and more white conquerors, their followers, and other whites were attracted to the breadbasket on the Nile. Canaanites, Jews, Syrians, Hittites, Persians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, Turks, Arabs, Romans, etc. They all came in, right? Intermarriages between conquerors and conquered continued, along with the concubinage as a national institution. Listen to this now. The direct result was that more and more Egyptians became lighter and near white in complexion. In short, they did in fact become more Asian in blood than African. Yet this upper ruling class of near whites was at no time more than a fourth of the population. For until the Islamic flood, which began in the middle of the 7th century AD, the vast majority of the Egyptians were what modern scholars like to characterize as Negroid. But what has been referred to as a social phenomenon was in fact a development among the half-breeds everywhere that ran counter to what would be normally expected, if not contrary to nature itself. This was the outright rejection of one's mother and her people, and a cleaving to the father and his people. While I do not know whether the overwhelming love which Africans generally have for their mothers is any greater than that among other peoples, it is certainly so marked that it has been a matter of comment by many writers. Some of the principal reasons why the half-breeds turned against the blacks and sought integration with the Asians have been pointed out. These apply to the blacks as well as to the new breed. They all sought security, advancement, and social prestige by integrating themselves with the current ruling classes, but the half-breeds have the inside track and all the advantages. I'm just saying, black people or people with African blood in them have been selling out on black people for the longest, for centuries. It's not new. We're not learning from history. We're not learning. The conquerors are learning from the previous conquerors, but the conquered are not learning. That's why we read these books. That's why we read this information. That's why we study this history. How do we better protect ourselves? Their job is to come in and whitewash everything. And our job is to protect it no matter what. In order for Africa to stay black, in order for our minds to stay black, in order for our culture to stay black, in order for our spirits to stay black, we have to embrace our blackness, but we have to fight to keep our blackness. But we have to know our blackness first, which means we have to study ourselves as well as study our enemies so we can better prepare ourselves and better protect ourselves and strengthen ourselves to become an empowered group of people. Make sure y'all like this video, comment, share, subscribe, tell a friend, tell a friend, tell a friend. Want to make sure we get this information out. Black people have to understand the why behind it. It's not just that. We know that Africa was black, but why did they work so hard to whitewash Africa, especially the Nile Valley, especially Egypt? Why did they work so hard to whitewash it? That's what this video is about. Man, I love y'all. I love y'all. Make sure y'all catch the next video coming up.